Tonight on First Tuesday.
What we hear on this record, that my father is condemning himself to death.
30 years after the Hungarian Revolution, a son seeks the truth about his father's death and speaks to those who witnessed one of Eastern Europe's most notorious show trials.
I said there was no doubt about Rajk's guilt, and indeed, had they given me a gun, I would have executed him myself.
Good evening and welcome to our First Tuesday film for October, one which remembers that this month marks the 30th anniversary of the Hungarian uprising. It was the savage crushing of that revolt by the Soviet Union which put the final seal on Yalta's division of Europe into East and West. But there's a story to be told about the road to 1956, a story which could not be told in full today, even in relatively liberal Hungary, but which is told tonight at great personal risk by a leading Hungarian dissident. It's about his own father, Foreign Minister Laszlo Rajk, condemned to death after a show trial in 1949, a death that he accepted as a necessary sacrifice to the system he helped to create. Ironically, Rajk's reburial with honour 30 years ago yesterday was a trigger for the uprising. That irony is explored here by his son, also Laszlo Rajk. In When Did You Last See My Father?, the son who will not accept the system investigates the father who did.
In 1949, Laszlo Rajk, the foreign minister of Hungary's communist government, was suddenly arrested. At his trial, Rajk, a lifelong communist, confessed to treason and espionage. Sentenced to death, he was duly hanged by his comrades. On a cold, wet day in October of 1956, the largest spontaneous demonstration in Hungary since the war took place in a Budapest cemetery. Laszlo Rajk, executed as a traitor 7 years before, was being reburied in state. The tears were not for Rajk alone, but for the thousands who had also died in the nightmare years that followed his execution. For Rajk's widow, his rehabilitation was a victory of sorts. The party had admitted killing an innocent man. But Rajk's son has inherited a strange legacy. 30 years later, he remains the guilty conscience of the nation. Years after Laszlo Rajk's funeral, the Budapest of today has the air of a city that has put the past behind it, a city where reminders are unwelcome. His name, like his father's, is Laszlo Rajk. Today, the young Rajk is a leading figure in the opposition, an outsider in the communist Hungary his father helped to build. Now, together with a Western film crew, he's about to unravel that dark inheritance left by his father a generation ago.
Szia!
Szia! Megszerezted őket?
Megint itt vannak nálam.
The records have come from the West, a recording of the completely fabricated confession of a man on trial for his life. As a communist student, he says, I betrayed my comrades to the police. In the Spanish Civil War, I sabotaged the efforts of the International Brigade. During the war, I worked as an agent of the Gestapo. And as Minister of the Interior, I was the tool of Tito and the Americans.
mindjárt az első akciónál meg is kell semmisíteni. Magyarul szólva, le kell gyilkolni.
That was my father's voice. He's confessing that he was a traitor working for the CIA, that he was an international spy. What we hear on this recording, that my father is condemning himself to death. I want to make this film because there is a tremendous part of history which is missing in Hungary. History is not only written in books. It's also told by persons. It's also told by our parents, by our friends. And in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe, people are not allowed to talk. I want to make this film because I never knew my father. I was 3 months old when he was arrested. I want to know the family story, and I want to pull out from other people, from those people who worked with my father, from those who were his enemy, from hopefully from his victims, the survivors. I'm hoping that I could get a better picture on my father, better picture than just, let's say, from the communists.
1945. Hungary, the country which had been Nazi Germany's last ally, was defeated and devastated. The government, discredited by the alliance with Hitler, had been swept aside by the Red Army. Picking up the pieces of their lives, the people of Budapest knew that the post-war world would not allow a return to the reactionary ways of the old regime. The new Hungary, built under the eyes of the occupying Russians, would be cast in a different image. The statue on Liberty Hill overlooking Budapest was more than a Russian war memorial. It was a constant reminder that in future political leadership would come from the East. Mateusz Rákosi was a man whose hour had come. Rákosi was a veteran communist who had spent years as a political prisoner in Hungarian jails and years more in exile in Moscow. Now he led the communists' bid for power. The war had brought a popular desire for change and widespread support for reform. But for a time, the communists under Rákosi had to be content to share power with other parties. The May Day celebrations concealed a vicious struggle for supremacy. A key figure in Rákosi's plans was his comrade, the young and ruthless Minister of the Interior. It's at this moment that Laszlo Rajk enters the pages of Hungarian history.
To be the son of Laszlo Rajk, it gives a special position in Hungary. I think just my existence disturbs a lot of people, because I'm the walking guilty conscience of several people who are still in power and who are still alive. The story of how the communists grabbed power is still a taboo in Hungary, and my father was at the center of the story. Dezső Futó was one of the men who tried to stop him, and one of the men who was swept aside. Mi gondol Dezső bátyám, hogy miért kerestem meg magát? Különösen azért kérdezem ezt, mert most találkozunk először életünkben.
Only life could produce the kind of fantastic head-over-heels situation which has been created between the two of us. The fact of the matter is that Rákosi pushed your father forward so that it looked as if all the dirty tricks were coming from his Department of the Interior. How could he have got himself into all this dirty business? Those of us in the other parties, we knew he was a good communist, a fighter in the Spanish Civil War. Rákosi said that he was the strong man of the party, and he was Rákosi's deputy. How could he have gone so far? I can only imagine that being involved in those political trials, in which he was on the side of the prosecutors, he moved gradually nearer and nearer the edge. And in the end, he too was pushed into that deep pit which was covered with sharp knives and spikes and spears. And that's how they skewered him.
Lándzsákkal, kardokkal volt kirakva, és ott nyársalták fel ezek az eszközök.
So my father was the hard man of the communists. But the real question is, how did he become such a man willing to do anything for the party?
1947, Rajk leaves a polling station knowing that he has done his job well. With Gabor Pater, the head of the secret police, Rajk's hardline tactics had placed the party in a winning position. Matyas Rákosi, the party leader, could cast his vote knowing that the Communist Party, backed by the Soviet Army of Occupation, would leave the polling stations victorious. Outwardly, the election had every appearance of respectability. Great show was made of efforts to get voters to the poll, but the communist victory followed a campaign of intimidation, political trials and election fraud. Popular leaders of rival parties had fled abroad or even been abducted to the Soviet Union. The following year, Rajk watched as Rákosi announced the communist takeover of left-wing parties, thereby removing all effective opposition. The communists had finally won power, but for many, the victory would not remain sweet for long. Within a year, Rajk himself would be arrested, and many of those who knew him could survive only by escaping abroad. To understand Rajk today, it's necessary to follow his old comrades to their places of exile. Julius and Koti Schörflin were both comrades of Rajk in his university days. Koti became a doctor. Her husband became a diplomat, the head of the Hungarian legation to Stockholm. And it was while they were in Stockholm that they heard the broadcast of Rajk's trial.
És annak három tagját, Rákosit, Gerőt, Farkas, fizikailag mindjárt az első akciónál meg is kell semmisíteni. Magyarul szólva, le kell gyilkolni.
As a Nazi? That's your father's voice?
Yes, yes. I have a very personal question. It's important for me. Could you tell me something about the personality of my father?
He was very upright, always to the point. And if he had one fault, which I can remember, is that I don't think he had a very strong sense of humor. He was always perhaps a bit too serious. And this may also give perhaps a little explanation of what went on towards the end of his career. Your father and I, we joined the Communist Party out of idealism, because in the 30s, Hungary was a cruel, unjust, arbitrary society, and we felt that something should be done.
It seems to me that my father was an over-principled man.
He was, to some extent, a fanatic. And fanatics are capable of doing harsh things. We felt that there is a fight going on, and you have to fight dirty, if necessary. Now, I know it's extremely dangerous to say that and always justify means, but at that time we did believe that we Hungarian communists represented something which can lead to something better. It was only later, and part of our bitter awakening was, of course, your father's trial.
It was more shattering, your father, knowing his character. It was inconceivable that your father would have been a traitor, spy, whatever. I felt, one, you cannot identify anymore with the regime. You know, you can't look at yourself in the mirror and say, we represent this country. And of course the other thing was, get out, get out of the whole thing. And in a miraculous sort of way, we did get out.
Did you feel this same personal danger during my father's trial? Or after?
Well, not in Stockholm. I knew that nothing could happen to me there, but I was 100% sure, had I gone back to Budapest, I would probably share his fate. So, as the proof came later, a friend visited us, I think it was in the late 60s or early 70s, and then when he looked around in our flat in London, he turned to Kati and said, well, had you remained at home, as a doctor, you would be very much in the same position today as you are here in England. And then he turned to me and said, you, of course, would have been hanged.
When we left, and came to this country, one of the great reliefs of my life was that we didn't have to take a stand on anything. By then, some people learn late, some people learn sooner, but we learned then, that. And it is a very bitter thing, because you have to deny your whole previous life and your beliefs. And it's a very bitter thing to realize, you were wrong all this time. But that's how it is.
Moscow. With the intensification of the Cold War, Stalin was rethinking his strategy. A Third World War seemed imminent. He now called on communists to look for enemies within the party. Stalin wanted a purge, and in the communist world, Stalin was a difficult man to deny. For a time, Rajk's position seemed secure, but Rákosi knew better how to read the signs from Moscow, and he saw an opportunity to remove a young rival. Rajk was being earmarked for sacrifice. In Budapest, Rajk's organization of President Tito's visit was a marked success, but Tito's refusal to toe the Moscow line had already incurred Stalin's wrath. Tito was becoming a dangerous person to know. A warning sign came in September of 1948 when Rajk became foreign minister. His job in the more powerful Interior Ministry was taken over by his close friend, János Kádár. In early 1949, the secret police were putting the final touches to the case against Rajk. Even his enemies have doubted if Rajk himself knew much of the brutalities and tortures which took place in the cellars of police headquarters. But there could be no doubt about this man, Gábor Péter, the head of the secret police. And it was into his hands that Laszlo Rajk was about to be delivered. In May of 1949, the secret police tortured a young communist official to make him confess that he was a British spy working with Rajk. After 5 years in prison, Béla Szász emerged no longer young and no longer a communist.
Béla Szász is a very important link for me, because he and my father were both in the same trial. He is one of the very few men alive who went through the same experiences and who might be able to tell me why my father confessed.
I am looking for Mr. Laszlo Rajk.
Szervusz, Laci.
Örülök, hogy látlak. Szerettelek volna más körülmények között.
Hát, nem baj. Így sikerült.
Köszönöm szépen.
Nagyon örülök, hogy találkoztam.
Szerettelek volna korábban látni.
You are the very few people whom I met ever in my life who is a survivor of the trial. And not only a survivor, but you wrote about your memories and what happened to you in the prison and how you met my father in the prison.
When I saw him, of course he didn't wear a belt, his trousers were sliding down, his shirt was open, and he was completely run down. I was absolutely surprised because 3 parallel lines crossed his face. I don't know, and it's still a mystery for me what caused it to him.
You think he was tortured?
I am sure he was tortured.
And what about you yourself?
I was tortured too, and many of the others were tortured.
Besides that you were tortured and all the other people were tortured as well, what other methods the Hungarian and the Russian secret police used?
They did tell us, to me personally, the deputy chief of the Hungarian secret police, that I have to give my service to the party. Everybody knows that I am not a spy. So I should give my service to the party to take this role which was prescribed for me. But the basic supposition that you are a believer, a party member who will even sacrifice his life for a momentary tactical move of the party.
So your weapon towards the police was that you were sticking to the truth and you weren't ready to cooperate with the Hungarian secret police?
Well, yes, I did.
And my father did cooperate?
He did.
Did cooperate
He
with
did.
them.
But his situation was a lot more difficult than mine.
And what do you think about the responsibility of cooperating with such a power, such a cruel, bloodthirsty power?
Well, what can one say? He and everybody of us did have such a fear from further tortures that he built himself a golden bridge for his self-esteem, that he doesn't give in because he wants to escape the tortures, but he gives in because he wants to help the party, the idea, which is in this moment maybe bloodthirsty, but it is still the future. That I can imagine that it was so.
As far as I know, it was you who showed the way to my father, to communist ideology, to the communist movement. And finally, both of you ended up in the prison. Actually, he was accusing you that you were a spy.
Yes, he signed the confession that I was a British agent, and therefore he did put me in the Foreign Office. And when we were confronted the second time, the confrontation was a completely formal thing. And what he said contradicted really what I said. And the first question was, are you in bad relationship with SAS? Your father looked at me and said, no, I am not. I am not. He underlined this, I am not. Which I felt recognizing that I could be maybe bearing grudge against him as he accused me. When the question was put second time to me, and I looked at him and I said, I do not bear grudge. I saw him. He was a man who was aware of it, that he reached the end of his road. And we smiled to each other, and that was the last time that I saw him.
What I'm after, that as a human being and a leader in a way, who knows that accepting a role, confessing something which is not true, is dangerous. Actually, he is as giving out names and in a way cooperating with the power. He's putting all these people into real danger, real physical danger.
Well, again, I have to turn back to the Leninist theory. Your father was a convinced communist, hard communist, and believed in all this communist morality. But according to this morality, 1 or 2 lives do not count.
That would mean that, that at one point, the Leninist idea is more important than any kind of human
private
principle.
Moral. Human.
Basic human principle.
Basic human principle. Because otherwise, as far as I know your father, he never committed any incorrect thing. He was...
As a person.
As a person, as a
his
private
personal-
person.
Mhm.
And he was an absolutely strong and moral man.
Mhm.
He was under the influence of this Leninist theory, and that made him to confess, that made him to put other people as well on the bench of the accused.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to carry on. I mean, it's a
And
very...
we touched
it's
so
a
many,
very,
so many themes,
Yeah.
really, which we should really enlarge.
and it's real, I mean, it's
examples that-
personal. It touches me. It's, In the summer of 1949, my father had been in prison for months. He was being trained to confess that he was a traitor to his country, and his whole life had been a lie. Outside in the street, an international youth festival looked forward to a communist future with cheerfulness and delight. The party said that my father was a traitor, but how was it possible that one day my father could be a hero and the next day he was a traitor? No one questioned what the party said. They just danced on the streets while my father waited to be hanged, and they believed everything.
In 1949, Peter Fryer was 22 years old, an enthusiastic communist and a junior reporter working on the communist newspaper, The Daily Worker. Fryer was in Budapest to cover the youth festival and remained to send home reports on the Rajk trial that have haunted him all his life. Today, Fryer makes a precarious living as a writer, working between his home in North London and the British Museum.
Hi.
Right.
Yeah.
Peter Fryer.
Laszlo Rajk.
Servus.
Servus. Oh, you speak Hungarian?
Only that one.
Yeah?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Nice
I'm really
to
glad
meet
to.
you.
Yeah, I'm
Well,
really glad to meet you.
welcome to England.
Yeah.
We have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I hope so. And I hope so that we can talk about it.
It was very nice to see you.
Thank you. Peter Fryer was one of those dancers in the street. He believed everything he heard in the trial. And in his newspaper, he wrote that every word of it was true. How could a man like this, coming from England, have been so blind that he couldn't see what was going on? Just to begin with, I would like to play you something.
Mitó feltétlenül ragaszkodik ahhoz, hogy a busz idejében, busszal egy időben őrizetbe kell venni a magyar kormány, és annak 3 tagját, Rákosit, Gerőt, Farkas, fizikailag mindjárt az első akciónál meg is kell semmisíteni. Magyarul szólva le kell gyilkolni.
I don't know if you understood.
Was that the indictment?
No, it was actually when my father was confessing to that the whole project, the whole plan was to kill Farkas, Gerő and Rákosi and all these people.
Yes.
And I presume that you believed.
I did believe. At that stage in my political development, it would have been unthinkable that I could have begun to have any doubt, whatever. You know, what can I say? I mean, once the scales fell from my eyes, then I went through a period of extreme anguish.
I was going through the daily work.
Yes.
Seems to me very strange that that thoughtful journalist would write it down and accept it as a fact.
Yes.
How could someone be who had access to all the information? Because I could have accepted in Hungary, you know, who were cut off from for most of the information.
You put me in a sense, Laszlo, on the rack, you see, because I suppose I can say that I was at 22 an instrument of other people's lives, that I was lied to. And the rationale, therefore, it was, well, Gallagher used to say, our attitude to the Soviet Union is the same as our attitude to the miners. Right or wrong, we are with them. And it seemed to me that in a world battle against capitalism, that one took one side or the other. And when I came back to London and spoke at Communist Party meetings on the trial, I said, there is no doubt about Rajk's guilt, and indeed, had they given me a gun, I would have executed him myself.
When Rajk was rehabilitated, I felt that I'd helped, unwittingly, to send an innocent man to his death.
And frankly, I went through hell for several months in 1956. I had dreams in which I was a judge who was sending Rajk to his death.
As I mentioned before, it's nowadays for us in Hungary, still in Hungary, for us it's very important, all the moral questions and moral basis connecting to my father. And what you think about his responsibility, accepting this role, knowing what was going on, and how do you accept morally the present day, not with your mind in 49, but present day, what you think?
Well, this is a very difficult question, as you must know, putting it. But if you're asking me what I feel about your father, I can only say that anyone who in pre-war Horthy Hungary, under that repressive regime, joins the working class movement, volunteers to fight fascism in Spain, and then plays a leading part in the resistance to Nazi occupation, is in my book a hero. Now, such a person was trained, as I was, to accept everything the party said and the party methods of lying, the necessary lie, as a weapon against the class enemy. And if he's a flawed hero as a result of that, then he was only one of thousands and thousands and thousands of communists throughout the world.
As Hungary had fallen into the power of the party now fell under the spell of one man. Matyás Rákosi was triumphant. In the huge purge that followed the Rajk trial, he had eliminated all his rivals. What the weekly newsreels did not show was a nation riveted by terror and fear. Under Rákosi, Hungary had become a police state. Tens of thousands had been tortured and thrown in jail. Thousands more had simply disappeared. 1 in 10 of the population had faced a secret police interrogation. Let them feel the dictatorship of the proletariat, Rákosi was fond of saying. Small wonder that even fanatical party members felt afraid.
Miklós Vásárhelyi, in the revolution of 1956, became a hero in the fight against fanaticism. But at the time of the trial of my father, he had been a fanatic himself. It was only later he realized the mistake he had made. Did you believe the accusation of my father?
To tell you the truth, I didn't care about it. I was a believer. I was a fanatic believer, and I told you I didn't care. I knew that some of the details are lies, that it is not true. But I didn't care about it because the whole, for me, was right, politically and ideologically right. So I threw away the moral principles and the moral values.
Could I say that you had a dream and you subordinated everything, even murders?
Yes, absolutely. It's quite right. It is very sad to recognize it after some 30 and more years, but this is the truth. And I must admit it today.
Didn't you have any fear that you're going to be arrested as well?
I had always fear. I didn't tell it even to my wife.
What was the reason?
The reason is that it's again the question of the believer. If somebody is really pure, if somebody is innocent, then in my mind, 37 years ago, he has no reason to feel fear. And if I felt fear, then somebody which I didn't know what mustn't be completely in order. We never talked about this until the period after the death of Stalin.
March 1953, Eastern Europe comes to a stop. Stalin, the titan of the communist world, is dead. On the streets of Budapest, there is 5 minutes silence. For a generation, Stalin had imposed his will first on Russia and then on Eastern Europe. Now the system he had created was leaderless. When the world restarted, it would never be the same again. For a time, Stalin continued to haunt the capitals of Eastern Europe, but the political climate was changing. In Hungary, Rákosi continued as General Secretary of the party. But now, under instructions from Moscow, he was compelled to share power with the moderate Imre Nagy, who believed Rákosi's policies had brought Hungary to the edge of catastrophe. The reign of terror was ended. Slowly, some of those who had disappeared began to be seen once again on the streets of Budapest.
Well, this is where my part of my father's story begins. This is an orphanage. After the arrest of my father, I was taken away from my mother, and she was arrested as well and sentenced for 5 years. I was taken to this orphanage, and I think even the name of my father wanted to be eliminated, so my name was changed. I was living here almost for 4 years. My mother's sister and my grandmother was carrying out a stubborn fight to get me back to a proper family. Since they didn't know what happened to my mother, they didn't know anything about her, they decided to adopt me. And a year later, in '54, my mother came out from the prison. She stayed with us. It was quite awkward, and some weeks later, she told me that she was my mother. And the mother whom I believed to be the mother, she was my aunt.
On her release from jail, Julia Rajk quickly found powerful support for her campaign to win justice for her dead husband. Returning political prisoners, men like Bela Sass, painted an horrific picture of injustice, torture and wholesale executions. Within the party, former fanatics like Miklos Vásárhely now pressed for reform. In 1955, Khrushchev admitted that the charges against Tito had been groundless. If that were so, people asked, how could Rajk have been guilty? The following year, at the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev denounced Stalin and described how innocent communists had been put on trial and forced to confess. The speech, made in secret, was quickly leaked to the West, from where the CIA ballooned it back to Eastern Europe, rightly anticipating that it would cause turmoil. The crimes of the past 10 years were coming home to roost. Now it was time for those in power to feel afraid. In 1956, Hungary's Prime Minister was 32-year-old András Hegedűs. The nation's economy was in ruins, and the government's authority was being undermined by revelations of its past crimes. In Hungary, it was not a good time for a Prime Minister.
In 1956, András Hegedűs was a Prime Minister with dirty hands. It may be this that makes him want to talk now. András bátyám nem félt?
Féltem, előtte is.
Yes, I was afraid before and after your father's trial.
Tulajdonképpen.
But when Stalin died, the fear amongst the leadership gave way to a different kind of fear.
És a vezetők körében átadta.
Fear of the people, fear of the people's anger.
Félelemnek a néptől, a népharagtól.
Fear takes different forms. In Rákosi's case, I remember that in one of his weak moments, in a moment of depression, he said that he felt as if he were sitting on top of a barrel of dynamite, which could explode underneath him at any moment. This was in the spring of 1956.
Ez valamikor már 56 tavaszán volt. Kelet-európai társadalom.
At the same time, there was a real fear of not knowing what would become of us if we lost power. In Eastern Europe, unfortunately, there's no change even today. There is no recognized way of retiring from power.
Kitaposott útja. Szóval hatalomból való kiesés.
And for a while, falling out of power could have meant physical annihilation.
Egyértelműen.
Meglepette benneteket az a hihetetlen tömeg, ami édesapám temetésén részt vett, és hogy elemeztétek ezt a vezetőségen belül, ezt az elképesztő részvételt?
Féltünk tulajdonképpen.
Yes, we were afraid. We were frightened that the anger of the people could burst out. And I certainly don't remember thinking that the large demonstration at your father's funeral was out of any love for socialism.
The question of Laszlo Rajk haunted the Hegedűs government. To rehabilitate Rajk would be an open admission of the crimes committed in the name of the party. But by mid-1956, Rajk's widow's campaign for justice was unstoppable. Rákosi was forced to admit that Rajk had been the victim of a provocation. By an irony of history, the ruthless Laszlo Rajk was becoming the focus of discontent for an entire nation. The great Hungarian Revolution of 1956 was just 2 weeks away. It wasn't just to mourn Laszlo Rajk that thousands came to his reburial. Some came in memory of lost innocence, a dream that had become a nightmare. Others to remember their own loved ones, victims of the years of terror. Laszlo Rajk's funeral had become a huge expression of outrage and reproach. In these faces, the government could have seen its future. The party that had killed Laszlo Rajk was now making him a martyr. It wouldn't save them from the people's anger. On a cold, wet day in October, this was the dress rehearsal of the revolution to come. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 broke out 30 years ago. These streets saw the fiercest fighting in Europe since the Second World War. Today, it's the government's proudest boast that in Hungary, 1956 has been almost completely forgotten. In this square, the revolution began with student demands for freedom of the press, free speech, the withdrawal of Russian troops, and the prosecution of Rákosi and others responsible for the reign of terror. It ended here 2 weeks later, as workers and students fought off the Russian tanks brought in to restore the communist order. Thousands were killed and injured in the revolution, and in the aftermath, thousands more were executed or imprisoned. But it's not these who are remembered as martyrs in the Hungary of today. These memorials are dedicated to the communists and Russians who died suppressing the revolution in the defense of the party. The wounds of 1956 have healed so thoroughly that it's difficult for us to find any scars of them on our consciousness, wrote the Party Daily recently. But the scars do remain. It was in the revolution of 1956 that János Kádár, the old friend of Laszlo Rajk, came to power.
János Kádár was the Minister of Interior Affairs when my father was hanged. Kádár and my father were best friends, and he happens to be my godfather as well. 30 years ago, it was János Kádár who executed and imprisoned the leaders of the 1956 revolution. And it was Kádár who visited my father in prison to ask him to confess for the sake of the party. Because of him, the story of my father can't be told in Hungary.
Today, Laszlo Rajk's son still lives in Budapest. By profession, he's an architect, but in Kádár's Hungary, there are no jobs for members of the opposition.
For foreigners and for tourists, probably Hungary appears a joyful place. But Hungary is not that much on the sunny side. There are very dark sides of the life in Hungary, and my friends and me know about this darker side. Truth cannot be told in Hungary, especially in the case of my father, and especially in the case of 56. For those of us in the opposition, trying to get at this truth is the most important thing, but we have to pay the price. The harassments are quite sophisticated. That means we are fined, we lose our jobs, sometimes we lose our apartment, some of us are beaten up by the police, but we never put in jail, because this would reach the level of the Western mass media, and that's what the Hungarian government wants to avoid. The system which killed my father is the system my father helped to build. It hasn't changed, and they hasn't given any guarantee that it will not happen again. How a country could be liberal and could be free if only the Hungarian opposition publishes and edits such books which are part of not only the Hungarian culture, but the European culture. It's just to give you an example that how it could be, how a country could state that it's liberal if Arthur Koestler is not available, if Orwell's Animal Farm and 1984, either, if all those periodicals which are talking about the poverty, about pollution, about Hungarian minority problems outside of Hungary are also published in a clandestine way. If Béla Szász's book about my father's trial was never published in Hungary. On the one hand, he was a straightforward, handsome, energetic, calm person. On the other hand, what I know that he was a liar. And he helped to build the country on a lie. My father stood for communism. And he sacrificed his personality. He sacrificed his straightforwardness. his truthfulness. He sacrificed everything, even his life, to the communism. It's absolutely right that I reject everything what he stood for. And it's absolutely right that he's an honorable person for me. I love and respect the man, the human being, but I reject his fanaticism. It's not that easy to learn what is moral and what it stands for. This absolute basic human right to learn the moral is stopped in Hungary, and it's stopped in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe. And that's what I try to regain and what I'm fighting for.
Laszlo Rajk was refused an exit visa and can't join us in studio this evening. However, I did speak to him on the phone to Budapest last night, and he told me that his two colleagues, shown operating a printing press in our film, have been threatened with exile from Budapest if they go ahead with a planned exhibition on the theme of the uprising. Rajk shrugs off the price he himself may pay, and he says that he feels that people have to be reminded that nothing essential has changed in Hungary. He says that the present Hungarian leader, János Kádár, despite his enlightened reputation now, is still the man who saw to the execution of the 1956 leaders, after trials not unlike that of Laszlo Rajk's own father. That's all for First Tuesday this month. I'll be back again on the first Tuesday in November. Until then, good night.